Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. You've undoubtedly spent at least some time reading one, and if nothing else, you've certainly heard about their amazing forecasts. We're talking about the Old Farmer's Almanac. There are several almanacs in publication, but there is only one Old Farmer's Almanac. It's been around for more than 230 years. It's the oldest and most widely circulated of them all. Well, there have only been 14 editors over all of those years, and today we get to speak with the current one, Carol Kinnair. She has the amazing story behind the Almanac, a publication that has the largest circulation of any annual periodical in the U.S. Carol will be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: his supporters say that this man does not get the credit he deserves for something he supposedly did in Fairfield, Connecticut back in 1901. Who was he, and what did he supposedly do? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer, because then you'll get the topic for next week's show. Dublin, New Hampshire, smack dab in the middle of New England if you look at the map. It's home to the iconic Old Farmer's Almanac, and it shares office space with Yankee Magazine, which is another quintessential New England-style publication, although both of them maintain a nationwide readership far beyond New England. Well, nowadays that readership is an interesting mix. There are traditional farmers who rely on the Old Farmer's Almanac for the agricultural and weather-related information they have, as well as new readers, many of whom are new to gardening and love the tremendous depth of practical tips and information right there at their fingertips. Well, there are a few things you can point to that are as much a part of Americana as the Old Farmer's Almanac. In their 234-year history, the Old Farmer's Almanac has had only 14 editors. The latest is Carol Kinnair, and she's our guest today. Carol's only the second female to edit this publication. She succeeded the first woman to hold that job. And in Carol's background, she was a journalism professor at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and associated with Yankee Magazine before taking on her current role. So, Carol, it's great to talk to a good old Yankee, somebody from New Hampshire who's editing the Old Farmer's Almanac. I want to start off, and I'll get your opinion on something, and I'll start off by sort of putting my toe in the water on this about what is an almanac. And I found one definition that I kind of liked, which was it records and predicts astronomical events with respect to time. Now, if you stop right there, you're talking about things like when does the sun and moon rise and set, weather forecasts, when do the planets align, when you have eclipses, meteor showers, growing seasons, things like that, things that farmers rely on to survive. And I started thinking even more about, we're so connected electronically now, and there are people who just live on their screens. And God forbid if the internet went out today, how would they even survive? Well, they would have the almanac. Now, set me straight. That's my view of it. You're the editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac. What have I missed? What is an almanac to you?
Well, by its very definition, an almanac is a calendar. It's a calendar of the heavens, and it's also a calendar of the earth. And so all the things that you said are right. Yes, back then when we started out in 1792, farmers needed any kind of a leg up. Every other person was growing their own food or for others. And so to combat the, weather and know what seasonally needed to be done, people relied on the calendar. And the calendar, as we know, our clocks were invented by the movement of the planets and the sun and the moon. And so this has continued. And I think this idea that also, we know a lot more about our universe than we ever did. And that actually brings fascination to it. But back in those days, a farmer may have the almanac. He might have the Bible in his house. So the almanac was really meant to provide something for every day of the year. And that's still true. You look at our calendar pages, the farmer's essay tells us what we're thinking about, what's on our minds. Every month is a new season and it brings new things to think about. And then we might tell you this day in history or what the tides are going to be or a historical fact, a holiday. All of those things are still relevant. And also we do that for every day of the year. So it's a timepiece.
There are and were a number of different almanacs over the years, but I just want to talk about the real prestige big ones. And we'll start with Ben Franklin, who started his Poor Richard's Almanac. He only did that, I guess, for about 25 years. So he started that long before the Revolutionary War back in the 1730s and went for 25 years and had the great saying, which was that lost time can never be recovered. And it was 9 years after he stopped publishing that a guy named Robert Thomas was born in Massachusetts, and he would start the publication that you work for now. Tell me about Robert Thomas.
He knew of almanacs, and he lived on his family farm, but he believed in what they were. There was other regional, local ones at the time, but he really thought he could do better. That was, I think, from the very beginning. In his 20s, he started the Old Farmer's Almanac, which was then the Farmer's Almanac. Old wasn't added until later. He was an amateur astronomer at the time, and so his interest really was into looking at how the sun and the magnetic storms on the sun affect weather. And so our weather formula, which I know we'll talk about weather as well, really is his formula from way back when. Because it's kind of crazy if you think about it, trying to forecast long-range weather. But again, with everybody at the time being farmers and depending on growing their own food and livestock, any leg up that you could have to know about what might be in store because weather impacts those activities, that was what he really put as the backbone of the almanac, and it's been there ever since. And so, for Robert B. Thomas, his recipe was always from the beginning useful with a pleasant degree of humor. We take that to mean we also have a charge to inform, but also to entertain. And I think he got that balance right from the beginning.
I like to think of the Old Farmer's Almanac like I think of the country, because it's really just about the same age, because he started this right as George Washington was finishing his first term as president. And of course, Washington would do 2 terms and then leave and go back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. But Thomas kept this up, and he obviously was having success. It grew very quickly. Tell us about the end of his editorship after 50 years. I guess he was 80 years old. And there's a great story, I think, about his demise, actually. Could you tell us that?
Well, as the story goes, he was editing the pages of the 1847 edition when he went to the great beyond. And so he was at it till the last minute. In fact, for the following several years, his astronomical calculations were used because he would do that work ahead. This was his life's passion. I go back and read some of his letters to patrons in the beginning, and it's certainly in the 1800s, and there were a lot of competitors that came up because he was so successful. And he often refers to them and says, this is why you, dear reader, you give us basically the lifeblood to keep going. Imitators and competitors, don't do as well as we do, and so we're very much indebted to you. And he had this sense of gratitude. He always stayed in touch with his readers. He always answered his readers. That's something we believe in and continue today. And so I think, again, he just had the right recipe and he lived by it. And so it made his almanac very successful.
Now, we don't want to dwell on this at all, but I think some people may be confused because there is a Farmer's Almanac and an Old Farmer's Almanac. How do you distinguish between the two?
The Farmer's Almanac, it's been around since 1818, and it's out of Maine. There's been a long tradition of other almanacs. The Harris Almanac is out of the Pennsylvania area. There's other almanacs that exist, but what they aren't is that we are the longest published periodical in North America. And, we are the oldest, hence the old in the name. And also, we publish, 2.5 million copies a year. I think the Farmer's Almanac is significantly less than that. So, our reach is greater. But again, in the hardy tradition of almanacs, it's good to have competitors. It keeps you on your toes. It makes sure that you're doing what you set out to do and do it really well.
So, Carol, there have been, or I should say you are, the 14th editor. And when you consider you just put out your 234th edition, On average, that means editors are there for about 16 years. So this is not a rotating door type of position. There's a long allegiance to the position that comes with this. We can't talk about all 14 editors, but there are a couple over the years that have done some pretty important things that I want to kind of mention. So there's John Jenks, who in 1848, he's the guy who officially put the word old in Old Farmer's Almanac. The other thing John Jenks did, and I think anybody who's ever seen the Old Farmer's Almanac will know instantly what I'm talking about, your cover is distinct. The cover with 4 distinct seasons. He commissioned a guy named Henry Nichols to draw the front cover. Tell us about that and the significance of what that's meant for your publication.
Well, we've had that cover ever since. They're beautiful drawings. They depict the 4 seasons, and that really gets to the heart of what the almanac is as a calendar, but bringing people through the seasons, what's changing in what we see and what we're doing, and those activities and the ideas of those seasons are borne out on the cover, as well as having our Robert B. Thomas and Benjamin Franklin, really the father of almanacs, on the cover.
Now, you've had editors, without getting into details, who have done things like focus more on farmers, and you got some who said, well, let's be more generalized. And then you had Roger Scaife, and he came along in the 1930s. What did he do?
Well, he did a few things. He was really a literary Bostonian. I think on the upside, he got people like Robert Frost and N.C. Wyeth, and even FDR's Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, to write and contribute to the almanac. But the one thing he did that will goes down in history is that he took out the weather forecasts, and that had a detrimental effect. Readership plummeted. People were incensed. People want to know what the weather's going to be, if at all possible. So even though he restored them in the 1939 edition, the publishers were ready to sell because it had been such a downward spiral.
And that's when Yankee Magazine and a guy named Rob Sagendorf came in. What did he do?
He bought the almanac, and it was kind of limping along because of Roger Scaife at the time. And he brought it to Dublin, New Hampshire, where we are today. And he really went back to the founder, Robert B. Thomas. He was a student of Thomas in terms of really thinking about what was that real recipe for what works in the almanac and what an almanac should be. And he touched every page for many years. He worked in a little cabin on the property of his home, and then now where we are today, and brought back, I think, the ingredients of the original almanacs and changing them for the time, for 1939 and beyond. So part modernization, but also very much hewing to history.
Now, of course, right around that time, 1939, 1940, we're starting to get into World War II, and a German spy was found with a copy of the almanac, and that created a little bit of a, well, no pun intended, but a furor. What happened there?
Well, it was then thought, who knows, maybe these forecasts could be used by spies. It helped our readership. We became popular because, like we all know, any publicity is usually good publicity. But it also called some attention to the almanac that we didn't want. And because of this supposed, oh my gosh, people could use the forecast, we had to call our weather predictions weather indications. We needed to change the tone and the flavor of that so that we wouldn't come under the scrutiny of people looking for, information that could be used against the US. So that allowed us to continue to publish and to be continually published throughout the war, which was touch and go at the time because of that.
Well, you're almost like you're in the spy business because you have this proprietary formula for the weather forecast, and nobody knows exactly what it is, and it's very intriguing, and people hear about this, and yet you're right far more often than you're wrong. I mean, up 80 to 90% of the time, you're right, and so tell us about this. I know that it's solar science, climatology, meteorology. What can you tell us that doesn't get you into trouble with telling us too much?
Well, I think some people wish it was more folklore. I think they expect us to, do something like look at the chicken's tail feathers and see, pluck one of them and see which way it runs. And that's going to tell us if we'll have a cold winter. But in fact, it is really based on science. And one thing I love here at our offices is to just walk down the hallway and see Rob Sagendorf's red pencils and blue pencils, his infographics mapping just what you said, climate information, regular weather forecasting, short term, what are those patterns, but really laying on top the layer of what is happening with the sun. Those sun cycles, they are 11-year cycles. We just passed the peak of 25, the 25th cycle. And so what that means is we just have a ton of data to crunch in our formula, how we factor that in with the rest of the elements. We've been in partnership with a team at AccuWeather for 4 decades, and they take our proprietary formula to help us create those weather forecasts for every day of the year for 17 regions in the US and 7 regions in Canada. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, and that we are so right. But again, it's really relying on looking at patterns over time, and then what else we might know. What's the jet stream up to? This year is a weak or a neutral La Nina, for instance, and we know what that can do to certain weather patterns. So it's very predictive. It is often right. We're predicting how far off of average the temperature and the precipitation will be, and then we go a bit further and talk about when we think storms are going to happen and if it's going to be snow versus rain and those sorts of things.
Most periodicals have a note from the editor or some such introduction for each edition. Back in the 1700s, Robert B. Thomas, the founder, started his almanac with such a note as well. He would thank his readers for purchasing his publication. Well, today, 234 years later, that tradition is continued as the opening letter from the editor is followed by the same words in the sign-off that appeared in 1792. Your obedient servant, Robert B. Thomas. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. You may have wondered why there was a hole in the corner of the Old Farmer's Almanac. Well, it was so farmers could hang it on a nail in their barn for easy access, and some others would tie a string through the hole and hang it up in the old-fashioned outhouses to provide some reading material. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Carol Kinnair, the 14th editor of the 234-year-old Old Farmer's Almanac, the latest in a relatively short line of editors who have continued to bring the U.S. institution to farmers and non-farmers throughout the land. The answer to this week's trivia question: his supporters say that this man does not get the credit he deserves for something he supposedly did in Fairfield, Connecticut back in 1901. Who was he, and what did he supposedly do? Well, his name was Gustav Whitehead, and he supposedly flew a plane near Long Island Sound in Fairfield a full 2 years before Orville and Wilbur Wright flew their plane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Next week on Amazing Tales, we're going to dig into this controversy that continues to this very day about who was really the first person to fly an airplane. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.